Good morning, goeiemorgen aan allemaal. Very welcome to the second edition of the University of the Free State's Thought Leader webinar series. Today's theme is the South African economy post-COVID, post-crisis. May I please ask all participants to please mute their microphones and their cameras. You'll see the icons on the bar inside your Zoom screen, so we only have the panelists on the screen. Before I introduce today's panelists, let me introduce to you the Rector and Vice Chancellor of the University of the Free State, Professor Francis Petersen.
Thank you, Max, and good morning and welcome to all that's dialing in and on this call to listen to this webinar. As a public higher education institution, it is our responsibility to contribute to public discourse. In 2018, the University of the Free State started the Thought Leadership series with the aim to bring experts on various topics together to address pertinent issues. This year, we are presenting the University of the Free State Thought Leadership series as part of the Free State Literature Festival online initiative. And that online initiative is called Vryspraak Digitaal, and in collaboration with the Vrye Weekblad. Higher education institutions globally are placed in a challenging context in the midst of COVID-19. Aware and grounded in the reality that the world will not return to the normality of pre-COVID-19, our responsibility as a university and as scholars still remains to contribute to public discourse and also to offer innovative solutions that will impact the lives of people nationally, in our country, in our province, on the African continent, but also globally, to help them understand and to adapt to a new world order. Against this background and the context, this year's debates focus, as Max has indicated, on post-COVID-19, post-crisis. And we have a series of 3 webinars. We already have had one about a month ago focusing on health and modeling. Today, the focus is on the South African economy, post-COVID-19, post-crisis. And then there will be a third one, which will, I believe, will take place around the 15th of October, that will focus on the political and socio-economic landscape within South Africa. Now, placed in a COVID-19 context, these series, as you would experience today, are presented virtually. Let me take this opportunity to extend my thanks and appreciation to our esteemed panel. Thank you very much for giving your time. And we're certainly looking forward to a lively debate and discussion. Our facilitator, Dr. Max du Preez, who will introduce the panel. I just would like to say that I'm glad that we have Max and Trevor on this panel. They both are honorary degree recipients from the University of the Free State. So I will again say thank you and welcome Dr. Max du Preez and Dr. Trevor Manuel, and we are certainly looking forward to the panel. Please enjoy the webinar with us. Thank you. Back to you, Max.
Our panelists today are Dr. Trevor Manuel, the chairperson of Old Mutual, among many other things, and Bernstein, the executive director of the Center for Development and Enterprise, and Mondli Makhanya, the editor of City Press. Our panelists will each have around 10 minutes to introduce the topic, and then we will entertain questions and have a freewheeling discussion. You will see a little bubble on your screen, a Q&A thing that you can click on and type in your questions, and then I will put these questions to our panelists. Dr. Manuel, good morning, and thank you for your time. You're up first.
Thank you very much, Max, and good day to you and fellow panelists and everybody participating. Thanks to UFS for the opportunity. I just want to start on a on a difficult note, I think it's quite important that we don't think that we are beyond COVID-19 where we sit now. I think across the world now we're seeing the numbers still increase. The fact that we have that we're down to level 1 makes us feel as though it is all behind us, but it's quite important that we don't lose sight of the impact of this pandemic that even the world's top scientists understand so little about. It's also important to just appreciate where we are. And my sense is that the hard lockdown announced at the end of March saw the economy hurtling down a cliff. Now, this happened after 3 successive quarters of contraction. And we find ourselves at the base of this ravine having tumbled down. And the question, I think, is how do we extricate the South African economy from where we are? And given the geography of where we are, I think that we have fewer options than we'd like to imagine. Let me also introduce a thought that may be somewhat controversial. The apartheid economy was essentially a mining and agriculture economy with the bolt-on of a military industrial complex. And since certainly early 90s through 94, there's been the organic development of a services sector, a lot of it in the hospitality sector, financial services, and so on. But the question that confronts us as a consequence of this 52% contraction in the second quarter is what remains standing. And I think that it's hard to recognize that we actually are still essentially a minerals and agricultural economy. And so as somebody once said, when the tide goes out, you can see who's been swimming in the nude. I think the 51% contraction in the second quarter must introduce a sense of urgency and focus to mind. Now, it's also important to recognize that we're not alone. India contracted 69.3% in that quarter, the UK 59.8%, Spain 55.8%, so we're not alone. But we need to be rigorously honest about where we are, and we need to also ask ourselves the tough questions of whether we have the wherewithal to reconstruct the economy. We've crossed the Rubicon now, Max. We, for the first time, are borrowing from the IMF, and I'll return to that in just a moment. And I think it's important as we engage in this discussion to understand that we have to think in political economy terms. And these rules are not absolute. They're about the rational interactions between the reading of the political opportunities and needs and the politics and the way in which the interface is constructed. To understand the wherewithal of the economy, I think it's important to just look into the rearview mirror for a moment and understand where we've come from since '94. The ANC's election manifesto in '94 was the Reconstruction Development Program. It was a program. It needed macroeconomic strengthening, because you may recall that just before '94, the economy had contracted quite significantly and the deficits were pretty high. So in '96, we launched a macroeconomic framework for growth, employment, and redistribution. And it took some years of decision-making, of institutional reorganization, but between 2000 and 2007, I think we saw the economy growing at a reasonable clip of more than 5% per annum. We also saw stronger institutions. We saw clearer policy. We saw an inflow of investments, and we had the luck of the commodity super cycle. We looked at that, and by early 2006, we were in a position to take this forward. We focused on accelerated and shared growth. And as Gisa then saw us collaborate quite closely with a group of economists, both domestic and international, and a new methodology focusing then on what we consider to be the binding constraints to our economy. End of 2007, big shock at Polokwane. change in leadership of the African National Congress, but also a rupture with everything that had pre-existed, both in political and economic terms. And so after the elections, 2009, there was a little bit of a flutter with a new growth path. It didn't quite have the same pedigree as what had gone before. There was work done on the National Development Plan. It was handed to the President in Parliament in August 2012, shortly before, in fact, the day before the events at Marikana. There was debate then about its implementation because the drafters, namely the National Planning Commission, were not of government apart from myself. And so the implementation was left to government. There was a disagreement in the tripartite alliance, particularly around the third chapter, which dealt with the employment and economy. And by July of 2013, the NDP was buried by the tripartite alliance under what was called process. I think it didn't ever emerge from that. And if we look at the period since then, every indicator suggests that we've regressed. Per capita GDP, R&D spend, the metrics that are necessary, but more importantly, the engine that drives change, what was called a developmental and capable state in the NDP, lost its capability as it was disassembled piece by piece by the Zuma administration. Since 2018, we've been treading water. One is reminded of the words of the person described as the father of nuclear energy, Sir Ernest Rutherford, who said about more than a century ago, "Gentlemen, we've run out of money. Now we've got to think." So we borrowed $3.4 billion from the IMF through its rapid financing instrument. And I think there's broad agreement that that $3.4 billion is unlikely to be sufficient. And I think that there's a growing consensus that we probably need a full-on standby facility from the IMF. Whilst the RFI, the Rapid Financing Instrument, has no obvious conditionalities, it's quite important that we pay attention to the fine print. In the letter of intent, which was jointly signed by the Governor of the Reserve Bank and the Minister of Finance, we committed to take action to revoke the upward trajectory of the debt to GDP ratio, and also a commitment to remove the structural impediments to growth. So it's quite important to understand what we committed to and against what we will be measured. The IMF, in accepting those commitments, also warned about the urgency and the sequencing of a series of policy measures to prevent what, in their words, is the risk of social unrest. They also raised a series of red flags that are important in the context. The first of those is the growth of the public sector wage bill, something that is in the public domain, and about which Nehao has threatened to strike. And the second issue is the scale of transfers to the state-owned enterprises. Thirdly, the risk of the curtailment of infrastructure spend. I think as we deal with the IMF, we need to understand that they would look at this in the context of fungibility. You have a single fiscus, you take money out to do one thing, you aren't doing what you expected to do, you aren't doing what you've committed to do in your letter of intent. And I think the game is going to change for us. And beyond the IMF, I think it's also important to understand that rating agencies would want to be heard as we deal with these issues. Now, whilst that has been happening, there's been a flurry of policy writing and discussions. The National Treasury launched about a year ago a paper called Reconstruction, Growth and Transformation, Building a New Inclusive Economy. Business for South Africa has worked on a detailed paper styled A New Inclusive Economic Future for South Africa. The ANC in July this year launched its own paper, Reconstruction, Growth and Transformation, Building a New Inclusive Economy. If you took those three papers, there isn't much to distinguish between the one and the other. The question is, How do you get things done? Now, what will be placed before Cabinet shortly is a document supposedly crafted by the social partners, an economic recovery plan, and in the version I saw just recently, it's styled version 18. I'm saying the truth is that there isn't much disagreement about these issues. Part of the negotiation, sadly, it was held up because in one of the social partners, there was disagreement about some parts relating to ethics, including whether government officials and politicians should be allowed to do business with government. It's tragic, but it's there. So I think that concern I have about these papers is that there's inadequate attention to public finance, which is what sets a frame for all economic development that needs to take place. And it's basic. It's a basic equation. What you have available to spend is the sum of what you can tax and what you can borrow. So if you look at taxation, it's pretty flat on its back. SARS was taken apart very rapidly using the bulldozer of Jacob Zuma, and we remember Tom Moyane. So that's one part of it, the lockdown that shut out all excise duties or sin taxes. And because of the scale of the contraction, there isn't much by way of either personal income taxes or company taxes. So I think the tax situation is exceedingly worrying. On the borrowing side, I've touched on this already, but we also need to get a view of the fact that the IMF has expressed a concern that our tax to GDP, debt to GDP ratio has now crept up to 82%, and there's broad consensus also reflected on by the OECD that by 2023, it'll be on the other side of 100%. It's important to remind ourselves that not so long ago, in 2008, our debt to GDP ratio was a mere 26.5%. If you look at the detail of these issues, in the February budget, our debt service costs and our health costs were exactly the same at 229 billion rand. So if we're spending on debt service at those levels, we're spending on the past, not the future. And as we do that, it constrains the policy option. A reminder that politics, especially public finance, is about the allocation of scarce resources. So we are in fact in deep trouble. Now I want to express a concern about a worrying feature of politics in South Africa. We're having a cacophony of ministerial announcements that seem to suggest that the system is broken. And these announcements are made without any hint or reference to the financial implications of the decisions being announced. And many of these are the voices of what used to be, or the pet or vanity projects of ministers, and that's hardly a way to govern. What this country needs right now is clarity on the trade-offs, and not even the social partners paper deals with the trade-offs clearly enough, because if you put money into one thing, you put money into an airline, it has to come from somewhere else. And so your ability to govern, your ability to exercise choice is severely limited. There are three, and to go forward, I think we need harmonization, certainly out of the cabinet room. There are three essentials. Firstly, to finalize and agree on the accord. Secondly, to agree on the priorities, because not everything in there can be equal in weight as priorities. And thirdly, to agree on implementation. There can't be a let-up. What South Africa needs now is essentially a Deng Xiaoping moment. You may recall that in 1978, it was Deng Xiaoping who called for a change and drove a change that broke from the iron rice bowl that China was used to into a new environment. He drove that program very hard, developed appropriate metrics, and we can see that China's grown to be the second largest economy in the world. To do that, you've got to be prepared to take risk, you've got to back the troops, and you've got to measure the change. And for heaven's sake, somebody's got to push the start button. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Trevor. That was fascinating. We'll come back to some of your points. Anne Bernstein, good morning. Thank you for your time. You're up next.
Well, thanks very much, Max, and I'm delighted to be with the University of the Free State and on such a panel of such sort of distinguished people, and to talk after Trevor Manuel. I'm going to really build on a lot of what Trevor has said, but perhaps put it in different language, and I'll disagree on one thing. I think that, let me start then by saying that we've done a lot of work looking at all this growth industry of recovery strategies and the National Treasury strategy, as well as the latest NEDLAC social partner document. And listening to politicians over the last year or so, as South Africa's multiple crises have grown and then into the COVID-19 lockdown and the economic consequences of that, I am very concerned that the seriousness of the situation that the country faces in terms of growth, in terms of the fiscal crisis or the fiscal situation and employment, never mind social welfare, the seriousness of South Africa's situation is, I think, not commonly shared. And if you listen to senior people in government, in the ANC, and elsewhere in our society, I don't think that the realization of how bad things are and the necessity to act is commonly shared. So that would be my first point I want to make. I do think we are in a very serious situation, and that South Africa cannot do more of the same. We have to reflect honestly on what has got us into this terrible situation, and then the COVID sort of exacerbated all our problems. What has got us into it, and what of what we have done previously has to change. And I think we've got to be very hard-headed about that and realize that treading water, as Trevor put it, or the situation since 2018 has not really taken us very far at all. We have to make some bold choices. The third point I want to make is that one couldn't exaggerate this, but I think it is fair to say that very large parts of the state are broken. They're corrupt. The policy bandwidth, the decision-making bandwidth in government is much weaker than it used to be. And we really can't think of a state, national, provincial, local, as one would like to, because it is now a very problematic institution. And that is a very hard reality to deal with, especially in a country like this, when we need reform, you need implementation, but who will do it if the state is not, it's in many ways broken. So not all, I must stress, I think the National Treasury remains not as strong as it used to, and there are pockets of some good performance, but the state is in many respects broken. And I don't think anybody so far who's been thinking about recovery is grappling with that reality. The president says we need to rebuild the state, and I agree with him, but he hasn't set out how he's going to do it over a period of 3, 5, 10 years. And I would support a lot of what was in the NDP, but very few people are thinking about what do we do tomorrow when we have such a weak state. Now, one of South Africa's strengths, obviously not perfect by any means, is we do have a private sector with real capacity. And I think the way they've mobilized around the COVID-19 crisis has been impressive. And this gives South Africa some leeway while we rebuild the state, we should, in the meanwhile, free up the private sector as much as we possibly can. Now, in a perfect world, you want a more competitive private sector, more entrepreneurial, all sorts of things. But today or tomorrow, we should free it up. Just think about energy. We won't get growth if we don't have an energy supply that's reliable. And all the things the Reserve Bank has done, cutting rates, for example, are then undermined by load shedding. But we know that the private sector has additional capacity now to help South Africa with its energy crisis, whether it's the mines, whether it's Sasol, whether it's the existing independent power producers who people argue could very quickly scale up to provide additional energy for the country. So I think that's just one illustration of freeing up the private sector. Of course, we would like the Window 5 to be implemented as soon as possible and many other things. But so thinking about what capacity South Africa has seems to me to be a really important starting point for the kinds of reforms the country needs. Now, it's my view that we will not move forward unless government's credibility as a reformer is established. And 2.5 years of promises but very little action of any significance has undermined that credibility. And I think you've got to start from that. What actions and implementation and results, positive results, would actually establish the president and his cabinet as credible reformers? And to my mind, bold choices have to be made. If we're to save what growth we have, if we're to expand growth, and if we're to make it more labor intensive, then the president has to start taking decisions that are more in the national interest and might undermine party unity. But until we start doing that, it's hard to see how we get out of the state of paralysis. And I don't say these things lightly. There are pros and cons either way, but we have to start taking these bold national choices. The governor of the Reserve Bank has talked of hard trade-offs that we have to make, and we need to itemize those, and we need to start making those. Now, South Africa is a society with a deeply divided history and many different parts, and obviously you need to consult before making decisions. But I am opposed to endless compacting. I am in favor of leadership and then using compacting to go in the direction the leadership is pushing. And until we do that, we will end up with lowest common denominator documents or agreements where things are fudged, as in the NEDLAC report in some respects, and where key issues are avoided and you go for lowest common denominator things. Let me quickly make a point, building on what Trevor said, that if you look at how people are talking about recovery, I think too little attention is being paid to our fiscal situation, which is deeply, deeply worrying, whatever word you want to use for it. And we are just eating up the money that we have, which is in very short supply, in paying back our debt. And I think the decision on SAA just exemplifies our lack of credibility in terms of commitment to reform, and will have consequences that I don't think are being thought through. So we've got to sort out our fiscal situation that gives confidence to investors, because that affects our prospects for growth. At the same time, we absolutely need higher growth in order to deal with our fiscal constraints. Let me make just two other points quickly. The one is that I don't think you can interpret a number of the documents, the ANC recovery strategy, the business one in some respects, the NEDLAC one, you can interpret them in different ways. But there is one key area where I think we have to resolve some key differences. The ANC thinks that the COVID-19 situation has opened the door for a bigger role for the state in many respects, although the document also moves forward, I think, in some important areas. But that document, the ANC position, is about disciplining capital, not enabling business. And I think that's one of the key divisions. The National Treasury document and the business document are all about enabling business, specific reforms to enable a more competitive and dynamic economy. I think the ANC still retains a commitment to a developmental state, a commandist way of dealing with capital. The last big issue is unemployment. It's really important to remember that in February this year, before we go into COVID, the expanded definition of unemployment was at 10.3 million and rising, one of the largest unemployment rates in the world. And if you're a young person, the situation is catastrophic. If you're aged 15 to 24, you're about 70% unemployed. 15 to 34, you're over 50% unemployed. We employ 500,000 fewer young people in pre-COVID 2020 than we did in 2010. And we should just think about the many devastating consequences of that. So I don't think you can fix everything at once. We shouldn't try to. We need to be very precise on what we need to fix and have some key priorities. But the key thing is to stop tinkering, stop tweaking around the edges, and actually implement some fundamental reforms in how this economy is managed and in a number of other areas. We have to stop pretending we have an effective state and think hard about the kinds of mechanisms we can use while we're rebuilding the state. And that's very difficult. And we should stop repeating bad old choices. What we need is reform, and successful reformers need a team around them that understand the politics as well as the technical issues and the levers of power, and can use those levers of power, but also are skilled at developing a new narrative for the country that can be a part of this reform, this push for reform. So you need a game plan, you need a strategic approach, and you need to pick some key areas for quick wins that we believe in this new momentum and can start delivering. Let me conclude by saying South Africa has all the potential to be a great African lion economy. All sorts of strengths we could build on, but we keep disappointing. And I think until we have leadership with a vision and courage to take the bold choices that we really need now more than ever, we're not going to be able to build a bridge away from the disaster starting to build up around us. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. I think we will have to come back to your opposition to compacting. I think that is a crucial element. And perhaps we should start changing our terminology and not talk about reform, but restructuring. But that's for later. Our next panelist is my colleague, Mondli Makhanya, who likes to refer to himself as this lowly newspaper man. He's anything but that. Mondli, you're up.
Yeah, Max, thank you. And I think I'm going to recommend that you be expelled from our profession for using the word compacting. Very unjournalistic. Thank you and greetings to everybody. And I just want to start off by saying that the last time I was on the campus of the University of the Free State was about 2 years ago. And I had a speaking engagement. And it was there's a cultural festival that the university hosts every year, and it was during that time. So after the festival, after the speaking arrangement, I walked around the festival and I found a t-shirt. And the t-shirt had, and it's one of my favorite t-shirts. I love wearing it, especially when I have people around the house. And on the t-shirt, it says, and you can do the beep beep at this point. The t-shirt is written, "Futzek, ek het genoeg vriende." And so I picked that t-shirt and I love that t-shirt. And I think it's very relevant at this point. And every time I look at that t-shirt, I think of the times we're in. And I think back to 1996, and it was a time when Trevor lost a lot of friends. The country was bankrupt at that particular point, as we all remember. We had just come out of 1994, and it was, we were just coming out of apartheid. And the government at that particular point had to take a very, very, very tough decision about what to do to stabilize the economy, to stabilize the country's finances. And tough decisions were taken at that point. And the president at the time, the deputy president at the time, the finance minister, and other people in the inner circles of government took very, very tough decisions, and they lost a lot of friends. And the country earned a lot of credit after that. We recovered, and between 1996 and 2010, 11, with very high growth rates, and we averaged about 45%. Yes, not fantastic, but it was growth rates that this country had never experienced in a very, very long time. But decisions were taken, very tough decisions, very unpopular decisions. Anyway, we got to 2009, and it is at this point, I think, that we need to acknowledge. Today, we are talking about the economy post-COVID, but we need to acknowledge that the economy that we have right now is not necessarily as a result of COVID. The disaster happened long before COVID. 2009, and what is now referred to as the 9 wasted years, the wasted decade, however you want to define it. The disaster happened over a period of 10 years. So when we got to March, when we began our hard lockdown, we were already in a heck of a mess. And we need to first acknowledge that before we acknowledge what resulted from the past 5-6 months or so. And what happened over those 10 years was the hollowing out of our society, hollowing out of the state, hollowing out of everything that had to do with making the country function. And when COVID happened, when the lockdowns happened, we were already in a situation where the worst outcome was always going to be the case. And of every major economy in the world, we got the worst outcome because we were already in that terrible state. So that, I think, should be our beginning point. And before then, we were already talking about, there were many papers, there were many suggestions, there were many proposals, there were many plans on the table around reform, around how to boost the economy. So our beginning point about what to do now should be about what should we have done before March 2020. And what should we have done? Trevor spoke earlier, and I think that's very important, spoke earlier about the NDP. Now, the NDP was adopted by the cabinet. It was adopted by Parliament. It was endorsed by the National Conference of the African National Congress in Mangaung in 2012. There was some dissent from the alliance partners of the ANC, the SACP and COSATU, and there was some dissent from other sectors of society. But universally, it was a plan that had been accepted by society. And you need not have implemented the entire NDP immediately. It was a 2030 plan, but you just needed to have implemented 20 to 30% of the NDP. Even 20% would have happened. Now, I think the fundamental thing about the NDP, and I think we do need to go back to the NDP. It is a plan, it is a solid plan that can take us forward, was the part about the capable state. And both Anne and Trevor have spoken about the state. And that if we just focused on that before March 2020, and if we can focus on that now going forward as a beginning point, fixing the state. The state is very broken, and there is no way we can move forward while the state is as broken as it is now. What we saw during lockdown, during the various stages of lockdown, when it was so easy for certain elements to be able to steal from very essential funds that were meant to help people, that were meant to save lives. It was the classic example of a broken state. So I think the first step is that, just to go back to that chapter of the NDP about building a capable state. I'm not saying that, as Nkrumah would say, that everything will flow from that. No, it will not everything will flow from that, but it is an essential first step. And building the capable state will enable us to fix the municipalities. Because that's where the economy really needs to happen. That's where enterprise needs to be. That's where small business will happen. That's where economic activity will happen at the local level, because the Anglos and the Rembrandts and so on will not build the economy anymore. We all accepted that enterprise needs to happen at a much smaller level. So fixing the state will start to do that. And then I think another thing that we absolutely need to do is have one message. The partners and then the network partners met last week, and yet another plan was put in place. There was a plan that was put in that National Treasury spoke about earlier, and the other panelists have spoken about. We have many plans. We've had many plans, but that was something that the nation had to be exercised about, and we need to exercise ourselves around that at this particular point. Again, you will not achieve everything immediately, but let's begin to work on the things that plan put in place. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Let's have one message, let's have one conversation as South Africa. One of the things that was very frustrating since 2018, when we had finally got rid of Jacob Zuma as a country, was that we started having multiple distractions. And that's one thing that we need to do now, have the one message. Let's not go back to talking about, as people have been now making noises around again, what the expropriation without compensation. We start talking about the land question. We start having like many different distractions. The one conversation we need to have is how to make the economy recover. Let's talk about one singular thing as a country. Again, tough decisions will have to be taken. It has been, over the past week or so, quite frustrating again to find us as a country talking about where to find 10.5 billion rands to find our ailing airline. Why is that a priority? We know what our priorities are. We know that ESCOM is a priority. We know that energy is a priority. We know food security is a priority. Unemployment is a priority. Why is it necessary for us as a country right now to be having this hectic debate about having a national airline? So all those things, decisions that need to be taken, tough decisions around the health of the fiscus. There are decisions that need to be taken around the public sector wage bill. There are decisions that need to be taken around issues about freeing up enterprise, freeing up the ability of people to hire and fire, and so on. Many reforms that need to be taken around the spectrum. Decisions that take a long time to take. And some of them will be unpopular, but they need to be taken. And if I can just round up by saying that the person who needs to take those decisions is somebody who has to take a decision in his own head. He doesn't need to announce it to all of us. He just needs to announce it to himself, and that person is the president. And the president needs to say to himself that I am happy to serve one term. I do not need friends who will re-vote me back into the leadership of the ANC in 2022 or back to the presidency of the Republic in 2024. He needs to do things now, knowing that he will leave a legacy of having fixed a country, and more importantly, having fixed an economy and lifted it out of the doldrums that were left by Jacob Zuma. And I think an important thing for President Cyril Ramaphosa to say is that I am happy to serve one term and achieve a lot in one term. Thank you.
Thank you, Mondli. Let me just remind everybody on this webinar that you can go to your Q&A box on your screen and type in some questions, and I will put it to the panelists. Mondli, I want to come straight back to you. It struck me as deeply ironic that we're talking about the National Development Plan, which envisaged a much better functioning state by 2030. And this past week, we had an outfit called Unomics who said, if we go the way we're going now, we're going to be a failed state by 2030. So, you know, the two extremes. Not that I buy into the failed state narrative at all. I want to put to you, Mondli, the question, if we're talking about President Ramaphosa's style of compacts with business and labor and his own party, and we're talking about a failed state, and we're talking about a capable state, are the internal ANC politics and infighting not the main impediment to a fresh start and rebuilding of a capable state?
Yeah. Okay, firstly, I must just deal with what you just mentioned just now about the failed state. And I think that people are very dramatic about the failed state, about us being on the path to a failed state. We are not going to be a failed state. I mean, we are very far from it. And the reason for it is that this place works. The courts work, the judiciary works. This is a country of laws, and we're able to solve things mostly. It's unfortunate that people take to burning things, and yesterday we saw people were digging up a road somewhere in KZN as a means of protest. But essentially the state does, I mean, like the country does work. We can head towards failing, and let's accept that. But let's not be too pessimistic about us being a Somalia or whatever. But to come back to your question directly, look, the ANC is, to put it bluntly, is South Africa's biggest problem at this particular point. It was once the leader of society. The ANC did a lot of things. It was a primary thing why we have the constitutional republic, the major forces as to why we have the constitutional republic that we have. But the ANC is the primary cause of our problems at this particular point of our crises. The ANC gave us the past 10 years. And the ANC continues to give us the crisis that we have. ANC is not interested in governing. ANC is interested in preserving itself. And what you have at Luthuli House, and which translates into parliament, which translates into government, even under Cyril Ramaphosa, is a problem. And it's not just the divisions in the ANC, it's the culture of the ANC. The ANC is just very, very rotten. And the ANC is incapable of making positive decisions. The president may have great ideas, the finance minister may have great ideas, and whoever else may have great ideas. But while we have the ANC as the primary instrument for implementing those decisions, it will not happen. What will come in its place? I mean, like, we have to live with the fact that we have the ANC as our government until 2024. What happens after that, we don't know. But it may still be the ANC until 2029. But we cannot, as a society, wait for the ANC to fix itself, for the ANC to unrot, if one can use such a word. What we need is the rest of society needs to take charge and actually drive things, and regardless of whether the ANC is in power or not.
Thank you, Mondli. We had a chat with Mark Barnes, formerly of the Post Office, this week, and his advice is that we should spend recklessly at the moment. And he represents quite a strong view that we should say growth and employment virtually at all costs. But then it seems as if our chef from Limpopo and others are far more conservative and are warning about the debt burdens and so on. Trevor, where is the balance between these 2 points of let's spend and get growth going and job creation going at all costs, but we can't spend more money?
Well, thanks, Max. I mean, spending like a drunken sailor is the easiest thing in the world. The question is what you're spending on. Are there properly considered plans, the financial implications of which lead to things like job creation, stabilization, and very importantly, confidence and trust in the decision makers? That, I think, for me, is preeminent. Now, I referred earlier to the fact that, a long time ago, there was discipline. If a minister wanted to make an announcement, they were required to come to the cabinet committee first. If it got through there, it got to cabinet, and they had to explain the financial implications of what they wanted. There then was a discussion, and ultimately, what government has, what it is able to spend has to be traded off. So all three of us have spoken about the airline. You want to spend 10.5 billion on the airline? What do you give up? Because if it's merely spending, then you can, why do you want a small airline? Why don't you outspend Emirates Airlines and get all of the latest planes and the largest number of them possible? Because that's what spending will do. We need to be careful, partly because our debt has grown and partly because we have to recognize that we have capacity constraints. Can I just go on to something else, Max? And that is, you see, it's not compacting in and of itself. It's the fact that there's almost the construction of equivalence between the state and its social partners. Each of the social partners has their own mandate. Each has their own raison d'etre. The trade unions must advance the interests of their members, and that alone. And they don't have any particular interest in advancing the whole of society. The only agency capable of doing that is actually the government. And that's why we have elections, and that's why we should be accountable. And so in the construction of the trade-offs, a la Mark Barnes, there needs to be communication about why you can't do certain things at particular points in time. Everybody, you know, there are some issues about which there's no, you can't disagree. I think that we've seen through the COVID-19 emergency measures, the terse and other short-term instruments adopted to help the very poor through society, and those things are correct. They obviously are correct. But we need to understand that once the state takes on something that becomes an entitlement for all time, then it will limit policy going forward. I think the hardest decision it will have to take when it introduced the temporary relief for 6 months is to get to November and to say to people, yeah, the 6 months are up now, it's over, you're on your own. It's not going to work like that. Entitlements will always be deemed to be that. What we're missing at the moment is the ability of government to take the decisions and communicate. Mondli referred to what happened with gear, and we knew that we could look to the union buildings and get the air cover that was needed. We could take the tough decisions, and we knew that we would march in step. And when the trade unions were unhappy, we would meet over weekends and continue to work at the issue, because you can't hold up decisions until you have absolute consensus. In fact, the term sufficient consensus is a term very much associated in our history with he who is currently our president. And I think that sufficient consensus means that we have to take the tough decisions, because decisions are not always going to be pleasant. And in fact, the points will be earned by taking the tough decisions, because respect and trust will come from taking those decisions.
Thanks, Trevor. And I wanted to turn to you on Mondli's point about the role of municipalities. And I think most of us will agree, those of us who traveled recently, that where we have pockets of a failed state, those are in some of our local municipalities. It is absolutely shocking. How would that be a good idea to focus there? I see we also have a question from Lacea Loader, who asks on the same topic: how can urban planners be influential in the land use management of a local municipal jurisdiction or contribute in the debate? But talk to us about the role, as you see it, Anne, of local government.
Okay, I think that one needs to start with Les's question, because it's so important. Unless we deal with the ravages of apartheid, essentially the Group Areas Act, which still exists in all shape and form, apart from the elite who have moved in together, unless the local government is driven to take the appropriate decisions about spatial planning, about urban development, I don't think we will get anything right. The idea that we can ever aspire to be a single nation will never be felt, because that would remain lacking. So that's the first part of it. I agree entirely with Les. The second part of it is that perhaps the construct in the Constitution about what local government ought to be is incorrect, because you know, at national and provincial government, you've got the separation of powers. You have an executive and you have a legislature. The legislature in this country doesn't exercise its oversight over the executive. And I complained to Parliament that for more than 2 years, not a single question was asked of me in Parliament. It can't be correct. How do you hold people accountable? And so the role of the legislature is fundamentally important. The same norms are held to apply in respect of local government, but they don't apply. You know, in 2005, at the end of May, we introduced regulations in terms of the Municipal Finance Management Act. that for supply chain management that exclude any elected official from benefiting from procurement. I just want to read a few lines from the regulations. It says, awards to close family members of persons in the service of the state. The notes to the annual financial statements of a municipality or municipal entity must disclose particulars of any award of more than 2,000 Rand to a person who is a spouse, a child, or parent of a person in the service of the state who has been in the service of the state in the previous 12 months. The name of that person, the capacity in which the person is in the service of the state, and the amount of the award, 2,000 Rand. Now think about the PPEs and think about the absolute gemors at local government. All of it is in violation of existing law, existing regulations. Why is nobody watching this? Now, until such time as you take the big decisions to stabilize the finances of local government. I was reading earlier today about the scale of the pollution of the Vaal River system. Primarily, it's something that the Gauteng and Free State governments and the Sedibeng municipality in particular have to be held responsible for. But we know that these issues will be with us for a long time. Unless you have a major intervention at local government, unless the norms and standards are recast, you may have to curtail the freedom of choice that they have. You're not going to effect transformation. Ditto for provinces. I mean, if you just pause and reflect on what transpired yesterday at the Zondo Commission about the so-called housing abuse in the province of the Free State, you know how bad these things are. And by the way, Max, your municipality that owned, where you were born, that owned 138 farms. How did that come about? Why did it come about? Why did nobody notice these things? What could have been done with the resources differently? And what has the impact been on the residents of the Free State goldfields as a consequence? These are important issues. And so I think that we need to drive a hard campaign to retool all of what exists as local and provincial government, and not letting national government off the hook. But the issues of national government are frequently right in your face and very obvious. Thanks.
Thank you, Trevor. And I want your thoughts on the municipal idea, but there's also a question from, I think it's Siore Mosala. In a divided country such as ours, is it possible to free up the private sector in a way that ensures that growth is inclusive and the Gini coefficient decreases? Does it have to be a trade-off between growth and having a country that works for everyone? Your thoughts on the two topics?
Great. Let me start with what I think is a really important question about inclusive growth. South Africa has to change, and our economy has to change dramatically to bring in 50–60% of the population who are currently excluded. People who are unemployed, people who, because our economy is not competitive enough, new firms can't emerge, all those things. So I'm absolutely in favor of that. And I think when we talk about, the phrase inclusive growth trips off the tongue very easily, but we don't spend nearly enough time talking about the inclusion part of this. And for me, this is absolutely vital. So one part of inclusion is a more labor-intensive economy. So there are more jobs for the workforce we actually have, not the highly skilled one we wish we had. That's one point. The second is we have to be a more competitive economy, and we need to look at this sector by sector to make sure there aren't barriers to newcomers getting in, new firms emerging. We need to look at the regulations, which also make it much harder for small firms to emerge and to survive. And the number of small firms in South Africa before COVID were declining. So the more we talk about this issue, somehow the less we do that really helps small firms, that will also help the economy become more inclusive. Now, when you come to the harder, the nub of transformation, if you like, which is a part of this question, I think we don't think about transformation rigorously enough. So I'm in favor of much faster economic growth and more jobs, partly because this is the very best mechanism South Africa has to change the fortunes of millions and millions of people. So that's where I would start. I think education is absolutely vital. Unless it's criminal that so many South Africans, mainly poorer South Africans, do not get a decent education. And the fact that South Africa kind of wallows at the bottom end of every single international table, comparative table of results in terms of reading and mathematics and arithmetic is just outrageous, 25 years into our democracy. And we have made some improvements. There's not been no improvement, but it's not significant enough. We should be competing with Kenya now, not Swaziland, not some of the poorest countries in the world. So education really matters, and skills training really matters for inclusion as well. So I think we've got to think much more about how we empower millions of people and include millions of people, rather than spending far too much time on elite transformation, on procurement issues, and so on. So that would be my thinking on that issue. In terms of the urban issue, there's a lot to say. Let me just put it this way. For me, part of inclusive economic growth is a much greater focus on the cities. This is one of South Africa's strengths, potentially, and we should make more of it. Most developing countries have one big capital city, and urbanization means it grows almost out of control. South Africa is in a very different position, which is good, but we don't make enough of this. So we need to look much more to our larger cities and metros, because that's where the core of the economy is, and the ease of doing business, and how we open up those cities to be places of hope for poorer people, and their transport is absolutely vital. It's another outrageous thing to keep you up at night, is the collapse of urban metropolitan trains. So the cities could be crucibles of opportunity and hope if we thought about them in the right way. Now, local government is collapsing outside a large number of, a few places are doing okay, but it seems to be collapsing almost everywhere else in the country. And I absolutely agree with what Trevor was saying about accountability and monitoring, but we also need to think differently about this. We need to, I think, really rethink how we think about what we pay people at local government. We pay far too much. There's no need for national bargaining, in my view, on this topic, of all topics or sectors. We need to stop this notion. Every few years we say, oh, we're going to send a whole lot of people to these failing municipalities and that will work. That doesn't work. Ultimately, it's about politics. It's about getting rid of this bunch of rascals in the local elections and trying a new bunch and seeing if they'll do better. And I'm in favor of local coalitions, and hopefully we can start to see something like that starting to emerge, of citizens who care about that place and who want to improve it for everybody there. And so I think this is a very big topic. It's important, and we need to think about it leading up to the local government elections. Max, can I say something? There's a question about compacting, and you wanted to come back to that, if I may. I'm a Democrat. I believe in Parliament. I believe in regular elections. I believe in our Constitution. Now, NEDLAC was a place we needed at a certain time when we didn't have a government and so on. But you've got to ask yourself, who sits there? It's not business, it's big business in the main. It's government at the national level. It's certain trade unions and not others now. And I'm kind of, we know the people in the room make the decisions, and we can see those through the history of many decisions, that the people in the room have made decisions they can live with and compromises they can live with. I'm much more concerned about smaller businesses, new firms, and unemployed people who are not represented there. Never mind the cities and other parts of government. So I think NEDLAC is a really problematic place, in my view, for our kind of country. And I want Parliament to be strengthened a lot more. I'm not saying we shouldn't have something akin to NEDLAC, but I think it needs some serious rethinking.
Thank you. And when you're talking about strengthening Parliament, I was experiencing a moment of depression yesterday when the ANC caucus in Parliament declared that the Minister of Defence had done nothing wrong by flying a delegation. And it just reminded me of the ANC caucus during the Nkandla debacle. Mondli, there's a question from Willem Lowe for you. And the question is a major part of our problem not the planning, monitoring and evaluation capability of the leadership in the office of the Minister in the Presidency? Can Jackson Mthembu do what is required?
There is nothing wrong with that particular department. The notion that it's a problem is wrong. I'm not sure if that's what the question is saying. When that was first conceptualized, and that it was during the Mbeki era, was that you needed to have a ministry that would look at everything, would be able to oversee other ministries, and be able to, in a kind of way, interfere. You said you were going to do this by March this year, and you have not done so. This municipality was supposed to have done this, and so on. That needed to be strengthened. That capacity, that function needed to be strengthened. And unfortunately, since that ministry was set up, I don't think you have had anybody in that particular role who has actually had the ability to implement what the vision of that ministry was supposed to be. And there's been a lot of resistance from other ministers who don't want to be looked at, who don't want to have at some point people saw it as a super ministry, and that was supposed to kind of like come and poke its nose into everywhere. And I think that has been a big impediment to that ministry being able to do what it's supposed to do, monitor and evaluate. And whether it's a Jackson Mthembu there or whether it's whoever it is who's there, it will not be able to do what it's supposed to do unless that person has the express power that the president grants him or her, and that person is able to do what they are supposed to do, and that person is able to, and that person and their officials are able to go into ministries and departments and municipalities and provincial governments and actually force things to happen. So, but again, just to go back to something I said earlier about the capable state, is that ministry, that department, is the place, I think, where that needs to start from. And with the express power granted to the people in that particular space by the president. And I just need to just go back to something that, that Anne was talking about just now, about NEDLAC. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. NEDLAC can and does work. Yes, it is a place where elite interests get together and make elite deals. But NEDLAC does need to be democratized. It does need to be much broader. It does need to actually be given the ability to just be a lot more robust and a lot more transparent as well. I think the problem that exists right now is that NEDLAC is very opaque, and it operates like almost like a cult, you know, in a particular space. And I think that needs to change. We cannot and we should not believe that Parliament can ever, in the next, at least not in the next 5 years, not in the next 10 years, be a place where things will happen. As long as the African National Congress has a majority in Parliament, and I'm not campaigning against the ANC here, it mustn't sound like that, but the ANC is very rotten, and Parliament will not be a place where good things are going to come out from.
Thanks, Mondli. I am happy to say that we have some young people coming on to our question section. First one is anonymous, and he or she says, I would like to ask the panel, as a young person that has to enter the working world and taking into consideration South Africa's unemployment rates, should I be scared of not earning a worthwhile income or even getting a job? And then William Awusi comes with another one. Are our current political leaders the right group of people to take South Africa forward and out of the doldrums? Looking at some international leadership trends, there has been a small shift towards electing young leaders and women who seem to be making a difference. Can South Africa benefit from an injection of youth in the political space? Trevor, your message to the young people who listen to us today.
Thank you very much, Max. I mean, I'm rather amused because in a few weeks there will be an election in the largest economy in the world, where the choice is between two 70-odd-year-olds. Yeah. You know, I do think that we need more young people. I do think, but youth in itself is not a guarantee of anything, as we see with certain political parties, even in Parliament at the moment. It's not a guarantee of anything. Sometimes there's a conflation between being radical and being rude. Those are fundamental issues. I think that part of what we need to do is to ask a series of tough questions. And let's start with the NEDLAC issue. I think the first problem with NEDLAC is that the skill set of the strongest there, and that would be the trade union, is wrong. Trade unions wage bargain, they negotiate. And NEDLAC is actually set up for social dialogue. And dialogue and negotiation are not the same. You've got to call it out for what it is. And so you need strong leadership. You need to kind of hem this thing in. The second issue is, I think, that the trade unions themselves are numbed. You know, they don't have to do much work beyond what labor legislation does in respect of bargaining agreements and so on and so on. They don't have to do too much. They don't even have to poll their workers, which is, I think, a fundamental problem, because union leaders can sit in their offices and call strikes and then enforce those strikes. That is so undemocratic, and that, I think, is part of the epicenter, and those same trends then get carried into NEDLAC. Let's come back to Parliament, you see, because the question about monitoring and evaluation has been raised. In terms of the Public Finance Management Act, there's a section 32, where there are monthly reports gazetted. So you can see what let's say you're on the portfolio committee for water affairs. You can see what the spending trends were in the fiscal year from the 1st of April to the 30th of August, 31st of August. You can see that. So you know what the spending has been in the past month and in the months before, and then you have to ask the question whether the trends are being met. And that is how you exercise maximal oversight. You know, I'd had to look at the German parliament, and the Reichstag or the Bundestag actually works on that basis, in spite of it also having proportional representation. We don't do that. We don't empower parliament. We don't ensure that the best get to parliament, and that being a parliamentarian is actually a massive calling. I mean, 1.2 million rand for being a year for being a parliamentarian is not a small amount of money either, but we don't require parliamentarians to live out their responsibility. I think that the Department of Performance Monitoring and Evaluation will always have difficulty, because the idea that you can create a ministry primus inter pares doesn't work. You need to put in place systems where the presidency knows what's going on, but whether it's actually a ministry is a rather difficult call. I think that there's something else that I'd like to draw attention to as well, and that is that when one reads the Constitution, then ministers are assigned to deliver in terms of their assignment. In fact, when you are assigned a ministry, you have to take an oath before a judge and sign off that thing. And the economics cluster, because I don't think the clusters work, the economics cluster in cabinet has joint chairs of the Ministry for Tourism and the Minister for Labor and Employment. Now, ask between them what economic development is, ask them whether they have the push from the departments to generate the inputs that they require, and the answer has to be no. And so the system has to be rethought. I mean, what we have now is the worst of Jacob Zuma style governance being done under the aegis of Cyril Ramaphosa, and I think it's fundamentally wrong. These are little things that can make a very substantial difference in the short term. But I do think we need more young people. We need young people who are determined. And I think that part of what needs to be looked at as well is the way in which people get onto party lists, and from there, the way they then get into key positions in parliament. You look at people like Zwane and Bongo as members of parliament, and also chairs of important committees in parliament. There is something fundamentally wrong. And it's not just innocent until proven guilty. It is about setting ethics as the epicenter of public representation, and we mustn't give up on that.
Indeed, indeed. Just on the youth thing, I think if we look at our present cabinet, one of the most promising ministers that we have seen in the last 25 years is a 30-odd-year-old Ronald Lamola, who I think is going to be a great leader in days to come. And there's a quick question from Rian Fourie. In which areas, he asks, do you suggest the government should concentrate its spending? Would you be happy with the broad idea of all the spending going into infrastructure, for instance?
Well, I'm not one of the infrastructure wallahs, if you kind of take my meaning. I'm obviously in favor of infrastructure, and I think there's some hard choices that are being hidden in the seeming consensus around we all love infrastructure, the new motherhood. You know, what kind of infrastructure, what's the balance between economic and social? And the point Trevor made right at the beginning, which is we have spent money on infrastructure extraordinarily badly in the past. Think of Medupi, which is part of what's got us into trouble. So I don't think infrastructure is a silver bullet. We obviously need infrastructure, and this has to be well chosen and then well managed in terms of getting it done, and then maintenance, and how we're going to pay back the money and what risk we take in order to do it. So I think urban infrastructure would be top of my list, but not exclusively. As I've mentioned already, I think one of the big problems in our segregated sort of cities, you know, the spatial legacy of apartheid is how do we connect parts of the city to the economic hubs, and how do young people get access to even get to a job interview or a place to learn some skills if you're far away from everything, and the cost of mobility. So I think that's a very, very important issue, and certainly not one the society puts enough energy into. So I think that's infrastructure is important, but it's got to be really well chosen. You've got to think through costs and benefits, and it's not going to be the big silver bullet in my mind. I'm certainly not in favor of a smart city, for example, but we won't go there at the moment. I think in terms of, you know, where do we spend the money? We don't have very much money, so we have to think very carefully about it. I would put a lot of effort into getting laws and regulations removed or improved, because that's not very costly. We could do that very quickly. I would think hard about, I'm not one of those who thinks the problem with our education system, for example, is that we don't spend enough money. We don't spend the money well. So I think you've got to be very careful about the money issue. You've got to spend it really well so we get as a society real return for the buck. We've got to think hard about this in the context of the enormous constraints that South Africa has fiscally now, where the SAA issue just frankly boggles my mind. So I think South Africa has a lot less money than we thought. We're going to struggle with revenue and with taxes this year to add to our problems. And the economy is smaller than it was, which means that I am in favor, I'm not sure if it's possible, but I am in favor of what the Minister of Finance has been talking about in his notion of zero-based budgeting. I think you've got to think very hard about where we put our money. And that does relate to, it's not so much the size of the civil service, because most of the civil service is policemen and teachers and nurses and doctors and people we really need. It's how we manage our resources so that we're getting the really maximum return as a society for the money that we spend. And we really are not doing that now.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Trevor. Thank you, Mondli. We've run out of time. I really appreciate your time. It was most enlightening. I remind you that on the 15th October, there will be the third Thought Leader webinar of Free State University, focusing more on the political side of things. I hope to see you all there. In the meantime, I hope you're all going to get up and go and practice your Jerusalema, because our president asked us to dance that tomorrow. And I have an excuse. I'm a genetic Calvinist. I can't dance. So that's the way it is. Thank you very much. Thank you, University of the Free State. Thank you, Francis Petersen. And a good day to you all.
Thank you.
Thanks for your